Hey everyone, thank you for joining. This is a webinar on employee communication, creating two-way dialogues that actually work. We'll just give a couple seconds for people to join the room. Awesome. So to give a quick background about myself before we get started, my name is Vivek. I am the CEO of Weave. Weave is a employee feedback company. We kind of specialize in conversational AI. And in the talk today, we're going to be talking about kind of general principles that you can apply in order to create really effective two-way communication and dialogue with your employees, especially in this new world of remote work. And then towards the end, we'll touch a little bit on some of the interesting technologies that we use to create technology that scales. So before we really jump in, I just want to acknowledge some of the things that we're all very familiar with. We are living in the new normal. There is this implicit understanding that employees have to feel safe, heard, and supported. And that's kind of an underlying backbone to the communications that we should be having, which is backed up by the stats. In fact, since COVID-19, we're seeing 95% of senior leaders demonstrating a sincere interest in employee well-being and safety. This number is important because it's up from about 60% pre-pandemic, which shows you how much of a cultural shift that we've gone through. As we're all aware, we are seeing a forced transformation in the way that we do work, and no one knows for sure yet, but very likely work from home is going to become something that's permanent for large portions of the population, not counting things like flex weeks. So what all of this kind of means is that there's a reinvention of the way that we lead. There's an immediate need to have a continuous, engaging, and two-way dialogue between our employees and the leaders. So now we kind of set the stage, let's talk about what does that actually mean? How can we project a sense of safety, competence, and empowerment in the way that we are communicating? Now, broadly speaking, the important things are creating a culture of empathy and understanding, making sure that we are understanding and engaging with every single employee, making sure that every voice is being heard, and creating very quick issue to action cycles. Communication from an employee's point of view shouldn't feel like a black box where it's a one-way interaction. Rather, they know that if they participate, they're going to see response and action happen quickly. So let's start with that first point, which is how do we create a culture of empathy and trust? And the first step to that is understanding what is trust to begin with. We see it broadly as three things. There is competence, which is doing things well. There is voice, giving people the opportunity, the ability and chance to speak, and ethics, which is doing the right thing. So another way to say this is that empathy itself is the foundation of trust in communication. And empathy in the workplace, it's not a program that we can roll out. It is kind of a value that has to permeate. It has to be expressed by leadership, HR, management, building a really clear narrative and a unified communication across all of the dialogues that you have. Now, this is kind of like an esoteric, high-level kind of thing. Let's dive into what does this mean in the workplace. There's four things that we think embody living empathy. While the dictionary definition is just the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, what we see as how to actually act on that is someone cares enough to ask me for my thoughts. They have understood my thoughts and proved to me that they have understood. They've showed it to me. They've kept me in the loop. And I know that this is not a one-off conversation where I need to quickly get everything off my chest, but rather an ongoing dialogue. If we translate these ideas into the workplace, what that means is we have communications from the company that keep employees informed on what's going well as what's not going well. There is care that is coming from an employee's direct manager, meaning the people that have the most day-to-day understanding and interaction with the employee are demonstrating sincere interest. And finally, there is a feedback process that is trusted to actually enact change. The biggest issue that we see from employees is that uh, they feel that their voice doesn't really matter, even if there are processes or structures in place in order to understand employee needs, concerns, and suggestions. It often appears as a black box without trust to drive change. Um, so on that point, let's talk about how do we hear the voice of every employee. Um, Now, the obvious answer is you sit down and have a conversation with them. And in an ideal world, we'd be able to have one-on-one conversations with every one of our employees on a regular basis, and use that in order to build trusting dialogues. What we found, though, and this is through a study that we ran at Weave, your average manager is spending almost 30 hours a week just in managing communication with employees. This is ultimately unscalable. It's becoming increasingly more difficult as we have more remote teams and more distributed teams. And it's a huge risk of burnout, not to mention impact on the quality of those communications itself. So in lieu of having those sit down one-on-one conversations, what companies often turn to are surveying type tools. Um, Unfortunately, surveys themselves are not enough. From employees' perspectives, surveys are often distrusted. They are not specific enough to employee needs, and they don't create enough actionable steps for managers to actually improve the issues of their teams. There is still this desire for people to have open conversation, and these kinds of tools are not really seen as a replacement for that. I want to briefly touch on what are some of the best practices for employee feedback. Now, the first is everything has to matter, meaning the questions that you're asking, the topics that you are discussing with employees have to have direct relevance, and there should be an understanding from both parties on how that conversation is going to impact a next step, how it's going to lead to an action, how it results in some sort of change. Second, wherever possible, get rid of the red tape and bureaucracy that's making employee communications become clogged up and prevents them from becoming truly two-way dialogues. The way that we recommend doing this is rather than having cycles where employees are kind of reporting issues maybe through some sort of survey tool that's getting analyzed by HR, that's getting um, uh, reported to leadership, and then actions get disseminated down to management, have very direct team-based cycles that are entirely focused on the employee and direct manager interaction. The other important piece that goes along with this is that everyone should know what the communication channel is. So, from an employee's point of view, I shouldn't be questioning, okay, I'm facing an issue. Does that mean I report it to my manager the next time that we connect? Do I send it over email? Am I messaging it over Microsoft Teams? There is clear singular channels that are identified for each kind of communication. So there's never a question of, okay, I think I've reported my need, but I don't know if people have actually heard it. The final very critical piece is having a immediate response or as quick of a response as possible Uh, the biggest issue that we see missing from employee dialogues and communications is that employees don't think they're going to result in anything. And oftentimes companies are taking into account employee feedback, employee needs, and they are uh, turning that into action plans. They're taking next steps, they're changing their strategy. But those things are very opaque from an employee on the ground's point of view. Uh, so, an important thing that we've found is there should be a response to an employee's feedback within 48 hours saying, hey, I've heard you. I have understood that you've said this, going back to kind of those principles of empathy. And then, whenever possible, fix issues within 2 weeks. Um, when this kind of cycle happens, rather than spending months or even years in very slow movement and response to employee needs. Instead, we start to develop really quick timelines of change. Um, Now, 2 weeks may sound completely unfeasible, especially for those of y'all who are at larger companies. What we found is when you eliminate the bureaucracy, when you're having direct team based communication, and when you start engaging employees in the solution building process as part of the dialogue that you're having, it becomes much more feasible to have this kind of speed. So we've been talking in fairly generic terms so far. Uh, um, let's talk a little bit about what specifically are the things that we need to be asking. So the first point to note is employee needs are rapidly and constantly changing. Uh, um, as the pandemic responses evolved, as companies adjust to work from home, uh, um, we see that needs are becoming increasingly unique and increasingly fast changing. For example, kind of around the start of the pandemic, we saw job security was the number one concern for employees. Just a month later, we saw that it wasn't anywhere even in the top 10, and work and life balance was the biggest. When we recently did our survey on the state of the remote workplace at Weave, we found that the biggest issue from an employee's point of view are things relating to work environment. Things like having the right internet access. Now, what all this means is that we have kind of the areas that you can start pulsing on. You're kind of going to have a general idea of the trends that are happening. But the most important piece is that you build the pipeline that's going to allow people to continue reporting on the most important areas. So at this point, we've kind of covered that employee needs are rapidly changing. The interaction experience has dramatically changed. We have remote workforces here to stay, which necessitates a way to overcome challenges that didn't exist when we could just grab a conference room in an office building. And that is why we created Weave. Weave is an employee engagement platform built with what we call empathetic AI, specifically to empower people leaders to have conversations with their employees at scale. As we talked about, it is easy to kind of envision what it looks like to have a couple of one-on-one conversations on a regular basis, but how do we have these conversations at large scale and with our distributed workforces? And how do we make that entire process continuous? That's where I want you to meet Kim. Kim is a always available chatbot. She has organic conversation with employees to understand their issues and needs. And she's got this very interesting combination of anonymity plus empathy, which creates the perfect space for very open and candid feedback. This is a employee at one of our clients who says that chatting with Kim feels like he has a new friend. Sometimes there's issues that he doesn't feel comfortable talking directly to leadership about. So he likes that he's able to chat with Kim. This is because employees feel that they're not being judged. They're able to be more transparent with confidence. Now, out of the box, we have many different goals, things like measuring the sentiment and emotion of employee needs, building the right communication pipelines so that we can escalate issues when necessary. We can route people to the right solutions when necessary. Um, Understanding if employees have access to the resources and tools that they need, identifying risks, um, and creating a ongoing engagement. Now we'll get into a second of like what are some of the specific conversation topics and categories that make sense. But an important point to note, whether you're using a technology or tool like ours or something else, is that analytics independently are not improvement. Just dumping data on top of already busy leaders is ultimately counterproductive. It's not going to get you to the change that you're looking for. It's just going to create tons and tons of data, which looks cool on a screen, but doesn't actually equate to anything in terms of the employee experience. That's why we recommend a very clear path to improvement. Now, again, this is something that we recommend regardless of if you use Weave or not, where you build a process that starts with having employee conversations, where the intent of those conversations is to uncover issues, to understand employee needs. Next, kind of meeting that 48-hour response time, broadcast a response to the issues saying, hey, we heard you. We are taking into account the things that you've said. Next, when you are action planning, you're trying to come up with next steps, utilize employees, engage employees in the solution building process, and crowdsource suggestions for improvement. This is an area that we see a lot of companies miss out on. I believe something like 90% of companies we've found in our recent study don't utilize their employees in order to contribute to or kick off their action planning. On the flip side, we see 90% of employees are more than willing to take part in that process if they were asked to be included. The final step is to have continuous check-ins. So this is not a one and done kind of process. You ensure that the needle is actually moving. The entire idea of this path to improvement is that from an employee's perspective, they should feel that if they're engaging in dialogue, they're going to see a timely response to their issues and needs. And from a leader's perspective, they should feel that there's never an unclear next step. It's always laid out how to get from a conversation with an employee all the way to a action, a next step, and a clear resolution. Now, what I want to do is actually show you an example of what one of these conversations looks like with Kim, our chatbot. Now, again, if you have the capability at your organization to have conversations with your employees, sit down one-on-one at a very regular basis, it's something that's scalable for you. It's not going to burn out your employees. That is fantastic. And these are some of the types of conversations we recommend that you have in those settings. For those of you where it's not something that's scalable or doable at a long period of time, this is how conversational AI can help you. I'm just going to log into Weave here. Just a second here. So I'm not going to dive too much into what the Weave experience looks like. Um, but I want to show you an example of a conversation that we've run with some organizations. So this is an example of a company that is at the start of the pandemic. They're trying to understand what their response should be. They're rolling out new software solutions to deal with the change to remote work. And they want to start building a continuous dialogue with their now remote and distributed employees. So I want to show you what that interaction would look like with Kim. So Kim, as I mentioned, is a always available chatbot. She lives on your messaging platforms, like a Microsoft Teams or Slack. In this case, she's reaching out over our web chat, and she wants to talk about how remote work is going. Now, the experience itself is fairly conversational. In this case, we see that her first question is, okay, we've been working for about 3 weeks. Are you feeling comfortable with the transition to remote work? So I'm going to say, no, I've been pretty stressed out. Now my spelling mistakes and grammatical issues, all that get kind of cleaned up in the back end. But Kim is also using natural language processing and emotional understanding to kind of empathize with me here that this is a tough time. And she wants to dive in and understand, is there anything that my company Acme can do to make the transition easier? So this is a common issue that we heard a lot at the start of the pandemic. Things like, I don't know, Zoom calls have been frustrating. Calls keep dropping. So I know now this is something that kind of Kim is going to relay on my behalf. Now she wants to know if kind of in general, that's a theme, if my work environment is kind of impacting and hindering my productivity. So I'm going to say, yeah, my internet is poor. I don't have a desk, so I just work on my couch all day. So you can see here, like the entire experience is fairly open text and conversational. So an employee is not really limited in the ways that they interact. Another thing that you can see here is Kim is aware about the programs that my organization has. And in this case, I'm reporting issues related to my work environment. She wants to let me know that my company has a remote work subsidy, which might be applicable for me. So this is something that we focus on a lot, which is not just understanding employee needs, but whenever possible, routing them to the right solutions as quickly as we can. The last thing that she's asking me is, since moving remote, has leadership been sending me time and communications? I'm going to say, no, it's very chaotic. We don't hear anything for a few days, then it's 10 emails with new policy changes in a row. So in this case, Kim's kind of empathizing with me again. This is an area that's really important, and wants to know if my company's recent rollout of Microsoft Teams as a communication platform has impacted things, kind of making the conversation feel organic while at the same time gathering some of the information that the company is really looking for in this time of change. So I'll say, seems like it could be useful, but people are creating way too many teams and it's cluttered right now, which I'm sure it is a problem that several of us have seen. And that's kind of the end of this interaction. Kim's going to ask if there's anything else that I want to share. In general, we see these kinds of interactions take less than 3 minutes of an employee's time, and don't really feel, they feel like a resource to an employee rather than an intrusion on their day. The last thing that I want to show you is Now, obviously, not every topic is going to be appropriate to be handled by a chatbot. So, for example, more serious things, if I was to report an issue like bullying, harassment, something where we don't want a chatbot to handle it, those are things that we're kind of going to immediately be able to flag for and pass off to human as quickly as possible so that when needed, we can still make sure that the right person is involved. Um, and that becomes kind of the end of our interaction. I'm going to jump back over to my deck here. Now, I know we've covered quite a bit very quickly. I hope that in addition to kind of seeing how our technology handles this problem specifically, that I've covered enough of the general principles that are really important in building very successful long-term communication strategies with your employees. I do want to pause here and see if we have any questions. Of course, while I'm checking that, if you are interested in getting a hands-on experience and chatting with Kim yourself, go ahead and check out Weeve.ai/meet Kim, and we'll get you set up actually trying a conversation with Kim hands-on. Great. So, question here about anonymity and confidentiality. So that's a great question. Usually, it is the very first question and concern that we have from employees. Now, of course, the entirety of the conversations that we have are anonymous. The names are never attached. All data actually ends up in aggregate. But what we found more important than just straight anonymity is confidentiality and transparency. Now, in employee communications, what that means is I know who specifically is going to be able to see what I'm saying. So, in the same way where I have complete transparency when I'm sitting in a one-on-one conversation, that, okay, I know who's listening to me. So I know kind of how much I feel comfortable sharing. We want that same level of trust to exist in technology solutions as well. Mm-hmm. So when I'm chatting with Kim, if I ever ask something like who can see what I can say or who's going to be able to read my data or things like that, we'll let them know exactly who's on the other end. That's going to see kind of anonymized and aggregated versions of their feedback. That's a great question. Let's see here. Okay, so this is a question about building the two-way dialogue and what that looks like with these kinds of tools. With Weave, the way that we handle building a ongoing and two-way dialogue is that there's a couple of different ways employees interact with Kim. In this case, what you've seen is just a quick demo of when Kim has proactively reached out to an employee and wants to kind of understand employee thoughts on a change that's happening in the company. But as an employee, I can also reach out to Kim at any time. She's available to me 24/7. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, when leaders and managers are actually seeing the employee feedback come in, they can be responsive to it. And when they're responsive, Kim will broadcast that back on my behalf, letting employees know that, hey, this is not just a chatbot that I'm talking to. It's really a resource in order for me to report my issues and needs to the right decision makers. Okay, let's see if there's any more questions coming in here. If you do have any questions, just go ahead and ping them into chat. Okay. I don't see anything else coming in. If you do have any other questions, you can always email me directly, Vivek@Weeve.ai. You can see my email here at the bottom of the screen. And as I mentioned, if you'd like to get hands-on and actually try out a conversation with Kim or learn more about kind of what the reporting features look like, or even if you just want some advice on your existing employee communications program and process, you can reach out to us. That's weave.ai/meetkim. Thank you for your time, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.